Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, the President and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy and Truman National Security Project. I'm here with Lockheed Martin CEO, Jim Taiclet. Thanks for hosting us, and it's really a pleasure to meet you.
I'm so glad you're here, Jenna, and look forward to the conversation.
No, absolutely. And thanks so much for our Truman members who are joining us from around the country. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to be here in Bethesda, Maryland, and to see you and hear a little bit more about your career and what you're thinking about and the nature of some of the defense challenges. So this webinar will be 3 days long. No, we're going to dig in. It's going to be a busy hour. Thanks in advance to those members who have submitted questions ahead of time. I've got them here, and I promise that we will get to them. So maybe just to get us started here, you are a Air Force Academy graduate and a pilot of many years as a part of that. Can you tell us just a little bit about your story and how you came to this role?
Sure. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and it was during the time of the moon landings in the late 60s and early 70s. And, like many young boys at the time and young girls at the time, I wanted to maybe be an astronaut someday. So I had that motivation. I was always fascinated with airplanes too. When we'd see an airliner flying over our house, I'd point up and go, "There's my cousin Billy." He was in the Navy. I equated that to being on an airplane. But I thought it was really fascinating, aviation in general. The second thing that motivated me to go to the academy and join the Air Force was kind of a sense of giving back to the country a little bit. My paternal grandmother was a single mom, when there was no support system for those kinds of things. She was a barmaid in the north side of Pittsburgh, ended up owning the bar actually at the end of all of that. And my maternal grandparents came from Italy, literally on the boat, penniless, and they came to the United States and made a great life. And so did my grandmother's family too. And so because this country gives people opportunities like that to advance, I wanted to give something back. And then the third reason that I went to the Air Force Academy was it was free. We didn't come from a family of means, and the affordability of that education was a factor. It wasn't the driving factor, but it was helpful.
So you get to the Air Force Academy. Had you been to Colorado before that point? Had you traveled widely?
No, I'd only been on one airplane before in my life, actually as a passenger, which was to go to another college visit. And my parents came with me, and I said goodbye to them at the bottom of this very big hill that you walk up. And then,
that's right.
Next thing you know, I was getting my head shaved, which was really terrifying in the late 1970s. I can assure you, to get your head shaved.
You had to really question your commitment there for a minute.
Well, I knew I was going to be there for at least as long as it took me to get my hair.
Fair enough. Well, so you don't have to shave your head in this role.
No.
But how do you go from the academy? So you graduate the academy. What happens next?
So I was fortunate and was able to gain a fellowship at Princeton University at the School of Public and International Affairs. And the Air Force at the time, if you were able to get a scholarship, Rhodes Scholarship, or Wilson Scholarship as it was called, Kennedy at Harvard, in the area of national affairs or international affairs, you could take time off and go to that program and still be an officer and get paid, which is great. So I took the 2 years there, went there, met fantastic a number of interesting and different people than I had gone to the Air Force Academy with. So great experience. And then after that, I went to jet school to pilot training, and flew T-37s, T-38s in training, F-5s in fighter training, F-4s for a while. And then I spent most of my flying hours in C-141 transport jet made by Lockheed, actually. So
that's maybe the early start of your Lockheed career.
That's right. Didn't know it at the time. It was a great airplane. We did air refueling. We introduced a low-level flying program for the jet because I'd come from fighters into transports, and joined up with another fellow who joined the squadron from special ops helicopters. And we said, we're not flying these planes in a very survivable way should anything happen. And so we took it upon ourselves, two captains, which is a pretty low-level officer, and came up with a curriculum and figured out, how you could safely fly these, very large airplanes that, 1,000 feet high, below canyons and things like that, and developed a syllabus to training.
Hmm.
Got the base commander to agree that he'd fund it, and it was ended up being used in Kuwait and Desert Storm. So it was exciting,
Yeah.
and really enjoyed the flying career that I had. It was a blast and great camaraderie with people that I flew with.
Yeah, no, I think every aviator I've ever met, I think always that heart of a pilot, it sticks with you.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, but part of also being in the cockpit and making those decisions, I'd love to draw you out a little bit as you move further into your career. You're making a lot of big choices, and some of them have to be deliberate and informed by a lot of data. And other times you're in the cockpit and you got to make a call.
Right.
How has some of your Air Force training informed the progression of your career and some of the decisions you've made?
Sure. The big part of the training is trusting your experience, trusting your crewmates, and trusting your equipment, but also understanding what to do if there's an emergency, right? Things don't always go as the mission plan would say. I never had an engine failure, knock on wood, but those things can happen, and you got to be able to react to them. One time it was interesting. I was an instructor pilot, and the student was in the other seat, and all of a sudden we got hit by lightning about a foot in front of the bottom of the windscreen.
Oh. Cracked
The entire windscreen on his side, like a spider web. You couldn't barely see out of it. So we did this sort of little fire drill where we switched chairs with another pilot we had on the plane, and we had to fly that plane back after being hit by lightning with a windscreen you couldn't see through.
Wow.
So you just had to react to it. Another time, it shows what people can do as far as a risk in a crewed cockpit. We're in Australia. There's a lightning storm, almost out of fuel, and our front landing gear wouldn't go down. So we tried all the checklists and things like that. But in the midst of all this happening, our flight engineer, who was supposed to be managing this process, froze and just couldn't perform. And I remembered enough of the checklist in my head that the other flight engineer, who was down in the nose of the plane, pumping this little bicycle pump thing to try to get it to go down, and I worked it out. And he said, "Sir, I think that this is out of hydraulic fluid." Because I got one more press, and he pressed it, and the landing gear went down and locked, and we landed. So it was fine. So not everything goes as planned.
Fair enough. So you trust your teams, you trust your equipment, and you have some backup, right? And some redundancy there. I'm curious, as Lockheed Martin has how many employees now?
We got 114,000.
That's a lot of people. And so you place your trust in a lot of your teammates and your colleagues. How do you think about building trust in an organization, especially as large and distributed?
So this goes literally right back to that early officer Air Force experience, because unlike maybe conventional wisdom, you do not gain prestige and authority in the military by just barking orders at people. It doesn't work. So the air crews that I was leading, say in Desert Shield and otherwise, there'd be 5 or 6 of us. I might be the youngest person on the airplane, and I'm the aircraft commander in charge. So you've got to earn their respect and trust. You've got to lead by example and with character. And if you don't do those things, you're not going to have a successful mission, or the crew's not really going to coalesce. Well, that's the same thing even as a CEO of a major company. When I arrived here, and we'll talk maybe more about this, Jenna, today, I thought there was a major change that was needed, not just at Lockheed Martin, but across the whole defense enterprise. And I knew that if I sort of just started barking orders about what I thought that change should be, it wasn't going to take. And so, I tried to be patient, came in, really got to know everyone, what their perspectives were, put out some concepts that, let's work these out together. And I think, look, it's taken a year and a half, 2 years now, but I really feel like not only does my direct team get it, like what we really think we need to do, I feel like legitimately now it's going through this entire organization. It'll take more time to get all the way through, but you have to cultivate leadership. You can't just force it. And that's what I've basically learned. That's how we're running the company.
And bring people along with you in that vision. And your role can't be expert on everything. Really have to draw that out of people.
No, this company is so incredible what it can do. I mean, I'm learning stuff every day. myself still. And we have some of the smartest people in the world that work here. We got 60,000 engineers, 60,000. 20,000 of those engineers and scientists are digital. They're software engineers, AI, data scientists, etc. We've got incredible human asset here. If we can direct it the right way, it will and can do even greater things than it was doing in kind of the past. And that's the really helpful thing for me about being really, frankly, new to Lockheed Martin, is that the base business and company and talent is so strong that you can actually take it up another level. And that's what Marilyn Houston sort of suggested to me as I succeeded her. Wonderful and terrific CEO in her own right. Her request of me was, let's try to take Lockheed Martin to the next level when you're leading.
So let's pull back from that notion of talent, because I want to come back to that, and I want to talk about engineering and how China prepares its engineers, how American engineering schools operate, and some of this. But maybe just to introduce a little bit of your broad strategic thinking. You've introduced your 21st century security framework. If you could walk us through some of the major components of that, because I think that really speaks to some of what you feel like is a big missed opportunity here, and we really need to pay attention. So would love to hear your framing on that.
That's absolutely right, Jen. And one of the reasons I accepted the invitation to join the management team at Lockheed Martin was, frankly, because with my exposure being on the board a couple of years, I learned two things that were relevant. One is that amazing capability that the company has inside of it, but also a better appreciation of the fact that we're in an increasingly threatening geopolitical environment. And that my concern was, as a citizen, that unless we change, we meaning government, Congress, industry, and the military services, unless we change the way we run the national defense enterprise, that we're at risk, and this was 2 years ago, that we're at risk of not being able to maintain an effective deterrent to war as a country in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. Now, 2 of those years have gone by, right? So I really do have a concern about that. And the reason I have the concern is that the defense enterprise still operates on what I would consider to be a 20th century model, a 20th century industrial model, if you will. We're well into the 21st century now, which is a digital world driven time period, not just a physical world driven time period. And the defense enterprise, I think, has to really quickly and rapidly evolve to take advantage of that digital science, that digital capability. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, it was a motivating reason for me to accept this role and try to drive that change. And again, it's not just our company, it's all the companies in our space. It's Congress, how it authorizes and appropriates money to do this. It's the military services, how they organize and operate. And it's the administration on how they actually create budgets and allocate resources. So this is a huge endeavor that's going to take all of us together to work on at the same time, where we've got to do and run the day-to-day, whether you're government, whether you're Congress, or whether you're in industry. So I think it's really important and really compelling that we really change the defense enterprise in maybe the most meaningful way that it's ever been tried.
So let's dig into that. What is the change that you want to see, and what do you see as Lockheed's slice of that change?
The change that I think is critical is to look at national defense through a mission orientation, right? And by that I mean, what are the most important missions? Like integrated air and missile defense is a mission. Air-to-air superiority is a mission. The way that the Department of Defense is roughly structured and industry follows is that it's structured by services, which organize, train, and equip groups of people to ultimately contribute to a mission, right? 100 years ago, the Navy had its missions, very little interaction with, say, the Army.
Right.
There was no Air Force. That's the organization we have today. We have Marines, Army, Air Force, now Space Force, etc. We need to keep that because that's a good construct to organize, train, and equip people to do a mission. But what we really need to add is turning that whole system on its side and saying, how can we connect people, equipment, and most importantly, data across all those services, across what the DoD will call domains,
Right.
space, air, sea, undersea, surface, etc. And that's where the 21st century digital technology acceleration can really move us quickly. We don't need to necessarily invent new things and buy new things to do this. We can take what we have, build a mission roadmap for, we've figured out 14 missions that align, we think, roughly with what the DoD is trying to do. And then let's build that technology roadmap with what we have today, equipment, systems, command and control,
Right.
et cetera, and link those together in ways that are novel and that will increase our ability to drive deterrence and capability.
Right.
It's a whole different way of looking at the defense enterprise. And so coincidentally, the US government is calling its strategy integrated deterrence, right? Joint all domain operations.
Right.
And our industry's role in that strategy is to deliver the capabilities to do that. That's what we have to do differently.
Right.
So we're going to start here in our company and try to take that orientation.
So this is is it one way to characterize it? It's kind of like next level jointness. It's taking the concept of service integration and adding that overlay of advanced technologies, adding the reality of a really dynamic and chaotic threat environment.
Right.
That is rapidly unfolding. Let me draw you out a little bit as an example on Ukraine, which in some respects is feels comfortable almost in a way because it feels conventional. It has markings of 20th century warfare and in some respect offers a bit of a binary that folks think, oh, I've seen this before. Feels like a land war in Europe. I think I know something about that. But in a lot of ways, it's very, very different. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how some of the cyber dynamics have played out, how some of the integrated concepts that you're discussing, what does Ukraine have to teach us about the future of warfare, even when at first glance it may appear like something that seems pretty familiar?
And I think driving digital innovation, in this case, on the fly, right? So the Ukrainians are taking commercial satellite data that's available to anyone, using it for, surveillance and targeting. They're getting other inputs from space, let's say, to help them do that. They're also using cyber in ways and defending themselves against cyber in ways that we didn't have to worry about 10 or 20 years ago. So they're integrating a lot of these JADO concepts like in real time because of the situation. And if you just took that forward and say, what's a real world example of this 21st century security concept? Well, it would be taking what we have today, which is a Patriot anti-aircraft or anti-missile battery, right? Everybody knows the Patriot missile system. Well, it's got a radar that comes with it. It only can see so far based on, trees or clutter or the horizon or whatever it may be. But now there are threats of cruise missiles that will go way beyond the range of the Patriot's own radar to defend itself and its battery. And it's there to defend a base or a ship or a port or something. So to defend ourselves, the Patriot radar alone is not enough to meet the current 21st century threat, which will come from farther out at low altitude. And so what we're trying to do, and we've demonstrated to the Department of Defense in real exercises in the Pacific, is that you could take that Patriot battery, you can then tie it to data that comes from a satellite that there's a missile launch. Then you can have an F-35 with its sensors get out in front and track that missile and send the targeting data back to the Patriot battery that can't see it coming. And only because you were able to tie those three domains together and those three services together, which would be Space Force, Air Force, and Army, you can defend yourself now. And also you're complicating the success equation of any potential enemy, that when they thought they had a way to defeat your defenses, now maybe they don't. And so that's the notion of 21st century security. How do you tie these existing systems together in a way that gives you increased capability every 6 to 12 months with relatively modest investments, while at the same time you are developing the next generation air dominance airplane, which will take 8 to 10 years to do.
Right.
But every 6 to 12 months along the way, we're going to have a better integrated air and missile defense because we're tying the F-35 into it. So as an example.
Right.
Okay.
So, and of course, this conflict is still playing out. I think there's a lot of learning, especially as the Ukrainians retake territory,
Right.
a lot of incredible leadership lessons as well. You hit on, you mentioned effectively that there are these different acquisition timeframes.
Mm-hmm.
For software, for airframes, you're talking about building out weapon systems, maybe on an 8 to 10 year, platform decision making. The world looks very different. Pre-COVID, March of 2020, the world looked very different. Here we are. That acquisition system is not living in this century in many respects. Software changes all the time. As a company that a lot of people know for those hard assets, for the airframes, for this kind of the equipment side of the train and equip, how are you thinking about your own acquisition strategy with respect to moving into the software space and partnering with firms that are not the Lockheeds, that have a very different orientation, who are funded in seed rounds and need to make a profit very quickly? They're trying to survive that valley of death, as it were, as they wait and wait and wait for DoD contracts to come through. How are you thinking about your own firm's competitiveness and preparing for that reality as you effectuate this transition?
So to start with, Lockheed Martin has had a venture group.
Mm-hmm.
So, venture capital group, essentially. It had about a $200 million budget, and it made investments in companies just like you described, early stage startup, if you will, with promising technology that might inform some of the products and services that we're building. I went ahead and doubled that as soon as I got here, I think within 6 months, so that we could get more exposure to that world and also up our game a little bit on when you go into an investment. So we can make larger investments now, and we can make broader investments in the venture type space. But I think the most impactful near-term way to drive digital technology into the defense enterprise and through industry is to partner up with those that are already great at it and already scaled at it. Scale is incredibly important when it comes to national defense, and an ability to implement and execute in often harsh conditions far away from your office or your plant is really critical, frankly. So what I tried to do was to turn to my colleagues that in the industry I came from, telecom and technology, where we were figuring out how to roll out the Internet of Things network of the future, right? The 5G network for Internet of Things at scale, autonomous cars and commercial drones and all those kinds of things. And so the best of breed and among others in that space, I called their CEOs and said, would you like to get involved with us? We need to change the defense enterprise really significantly. You've got great technology we could use. Would you be interested in collaborating with Lockheed Martin? And they all said yes. So we've got like a 12 company dream team, if you will, that's working with us. Some of them are public. We've announced accomplishments or teaming that we've done. For example, Intel, we're collaborating on chips that have better cybersecurity built into them, better anti-tamper built into them, so that the Defense Department doesn't have to buy a small batch of specially made chips from an Intel, for example. So we want to take those chips off the main line and then customize them a little bit, not have our own bespoke design. That also helps the commercial world that's going to buy most of those chips, because they're going to need, especially in an IoT world, they're going to need anti-tamper and cyber secure chips that are made from a reliable source in the United States, because we don't want our future autonomous car system to get hacked.
Right.
For example.
So I'm going to go to the CHIPS Act in just a second, but before we leave this concept of venture and Lockheed's support for earlier stage companies, how do you think about, are you seeding the partners of tomorrow with this? Part of this is growing a capability that you don't have, and it makes the acquisition later easier. It's part of it is also working with existing larger companies like Intel. What's the split on some of those things as you think about capabilities?
So I think traditionally in our industry, if you needed a capability, you went and found somebody, a supplier, and bought
Yeah.
them and integrated them into your company. I think in the Newtonian or physical world, we're capable of doing that at Lockheed Martin or Raytheon Technologies or Boeing. But when it comes to digital world advancement and integration, I'm not sure we want to test that right away. Our culture is not far enough along probably in these companies to be able to run a startup software business inside of a Lockheed Martin, for example, effectively. Also, they're going to want to serve a much broader constituency than just the aerospace and defense industry. If you're a software firm and you've got a great technology or app that you want to grow your business. So we think that either minority investments, venture type startup ownership, we'll take a 10 or 20% stake. We're not going to buy the whole thing. Because we want them to go live in their world and do what they're doing. And we want to take advantage of whatever technology might apply to us. So we at Lockheed Martin, I think, create a really effective bridge between whether it's the startup community, mid-size, kind of mid-development company, or even our partners that we've announced, like Microsoft, Verizon, et cetera, working with us to bridge their commercial technology that they're continuing to develop into national defense. And the CEO of Verizon, who's I've known for a long time, on one of our summit calls, he said, we really like partnering with you because your problems are easier than ours. And I was like, yeah, that's what my reaction to it. And he says, no, look, I've got to create a network someday with, they'll control 100 million autonomous vehicles on roads in the United States. And you've only got to try to tie 8 airplanes together, for now. It'll get more complex. So we are farther out ahead of commercial industry when it comes to a resilient network, for example, which is what Verizon's going to want to develop. We're working with Microsoft very closely on distributed cloud that can handle classified data, for example. They're a leader in distributed cloud computing. We need that for our vision, and we're teamed up with Microsoft. So Verizon, AT&T, we just announced last week, we're doing with data diagnostics on helicopters. So we're getting really great teamwork, and we don't have to acquire these companies. First of all, the large ones are too big for us to acquire in the first place, but even those smaller ones, you got to let them run with their DNA and their space, but take the best that they can offer for what we need. And we'll finance them, or we'll sponsor them, or we'll put someone on their board to advise them. Those are good relationships. So we don't have to own and operate everything ourselves anymore.
Right. And so you've talked about how Lockheed is kind of meeting this moment and how you're thinking about how to incubate new advanced technology, the work that you're doing on teaming. What are a few things that the U.S. government needs to do to meet this moment? Is there low-hanging fruit? Some of these things are harder than others, but if you had a magic wand on some of this stuff, what do you think what would make the fight a lot easier and more winnable?
First of all, there's a lot of goodness about how our government is structured in this area. There's a division of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch, for example, which is a good thing because the legislative branch authorizes what can be paid for and then appropriates money to actually go ahead and do that. And the administration, puts in a first budget and then it gets worked through the legislative and the executive branch. So it's a good system. However, it's slower than it should be, we think. We've been operating in a non-peer threat environment for decades, maybe since the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And so our system has not had to react at fast pace. We could methodically do whatever process we thought we wanted to do for acquisition or for budgeting, but those processes, I think, could be streamlined. So that's one thing. A second thing is when we try to get our allies involved in these kinds of things, we have to jointly go through a process for foreign sales. And that involves, again, a good thing. The State Department comes into play with the DoD and works through that process. So there are ways to, I think, streamline the processes. What we've suggested to our colleagues at the DoD and other parts of the government is let's just get the workflows laid out between industry, Congress, executive branch, military service. Let's just get in the room. This has just worked really well in the telecom industry, where we're trying to build that. In fact, if you take the time I was at my company, American Tower, we went from 2G telecom, the flip phone,
Yep.
to 3G to 4G, and now we're at 5G autonomy now in the span of like 20 years. That's pretty fast motion. Yeah. And so how can we take some of those lessons and accelerate what we do in national defense? Because we are now in a competitive situation with China and Russia that are trying to get ahead of us on all these things.
Yeah, so this is a great segue to talking about the CHIPS Act and the work that you've done there, because this is really about competitiveness, economic competitiveness, maintaining that deterrence capability. Can you talk a little bit about, I think a lot of our listeners here who are joining us today have some familiarity, but can you give us a little bit of CHIPS 101, and then would love to hear your frame on what do you think the next couple of years look like? What is really the threat? What's the opportunity for manufacturing, and how Lockheed is thinking about some of this?
So the history of microprocessor design, so the process is design, manufacture, and test the chips for production and distribution. The design, large part, is still the United States. So you have the Apples of the world, Qualcomm, et cetera. They're designing chip architectures that are very complex and sophisticated, but most of the manufacturing and test is done outside the United States now, is sent overseas at various points in time. For good reasons, the company management started at that moment. But when you aggregated all that outsourcing together, you find out that the U.S. is only a fraction of a small fraction of the especially the sophisticated chip test and manufacturing. That's an imbalance that I think is a risk. And I kind of turn back to Nassim Taleb's book called Anti-Fragile, meaning you have a system that has a real vulnerability here. And the vulnerability for our system, not just the defense enterprise, but the entire US economy and allied economy, is there's a huge concentration of microchip assembly, manufacturing and test in two places, China and Taiwan. If China decided to, as Russia has recently done, boycott the export of a important input, it was natural gas in Europe, it could be microchips out of China,
right, and
somehow then blockaded or cyber attacked the Taiwanese chip industry, our defense enterprise and our economy would suffer dramatic downturn from that. And so how do you get rid of that fragility? You've got to bring some of that manufacturing and test capability back to the United States or our very close allies, or preferably both. So that was why we advocated so strongly for the CHIPS Act. Is there's a geostrategic vulnerability, there's an economic vulnerability, and there's a vulnerability for companies like ours to actually continue to provide the defense items that the country needs. And that's why we advocated so strongly for the CHIPS Act. We're in a very fragile position right now in microchips.
Where do you feel like microchips take us in the next 10 years? Like, what is the fight that has to be won as you kind of look out over the near horizon? We got to get the stuff built. We have to build some kind of indigenous manufacturing capability here. You talked a little bit about other countries. Are there logical partners for that? And just how does this kind of roll out?
Sure. So the Netherlands already is the leading place to actually build the test equipment to test the chips, right? So that's a natural partner. The UK, Australia, countries like that we are close allies with and have pretty reliable trade relationships with, should all be part of the answer here.
So I want to go a little bit back to some of what you talked about with the nature of how you're thinking about the company, some of the decisions that are being made. We're heading into midterm elections. We have at a moment in our history a lot of polarization. We know this in a lot of different ways. We in our politics are somewhat unpredictable. We have an economy that feels at once strong but also fragile and subject to price increases. We're facing inflation, and it's gone down at the pump. We're seeing it in other places. How do you think about weathering what feels like an increasingly uncertain future domestically? And I want to kind of get into some of these vulnerabilities and how you think about that preparation as we also start to talk about climate change?
Sure. So there's a huge risk on workforce right now, for example, both in the commercial economy, in government as well, and in our industry. And so we've tried to make our workplace a more inviting, venue to be in, right? So really, even before the pandemic, we went to a 4-day work week for most of the employees that were eligible to do that. So if you're working in a factory or a customer classified location, and maybe you have to be there 5 or 6 days or whatever, that we can't change that. But for the bulk of our workforce, we're able to go to Monday through Friday, 10 days, Monday through Thursday, 10 days, 10 hours a day. And that gave everybody a 3-day weekend. So most companies hadn't even, thought of that or done that in the United States, but we can make it work. After COVID, we learned a lot about how could remote work really be sustainable, more than a day a week off. And now we're down to 2 or 3 days a week where people need to be on site in our company, again, for the most part. So that helps make it a more attractive employer for people with choices. We probably won't go, except for a sliver of our workforce, to full remote, because this is an engineering and manufacturing company in large part. And collaboration is really, really important, especially if you're going to do a 21st century security concept, which means you need more collaboration versus less. So we're doing some things on the workforce front to try to take some of the risk out of our being able to operate in this really volatile environment that you're talking about.
So, and certainly unemployment levels are so tight, 2%, and feels even tighter in the DC area and in this world. You talked a little bit about flexibility. How are you thinking about diversity? How are you thinking about creating a workforce, a workplace environment that feels inviting, that's not just about representation, which is very important, but which is also about inclusivity and equity?
Yeah, and this is really crucial because I would consider our product here, we're an aerospace and defense company, but our product is deterrence. So I would consider that maybe one of the most valuable products in the world is deterrence from conflict or war. So we need the very best people in the world that we can get to work here. And it doesn't matter, what they look like, color of their skin, interests they have outside, who they want to date. It doesn't matter. We need to find the best talents in the world to work at Lockheed Martin because of our mission. And so we have a legacy here, predates me by a long, long time, of finding the best people, no matter where they may be going to school or where they may have grown up. And so the company's been a huge and still is a huge supporter of historically Black colleges and universities, other diverse minorities institutions. And we have internally to the company something I think is fantastic. It's called business resource groups. And it's basically affinity groups for veterans, for people with disabilities, we have one. For Asian Americans, we have one. And so there's about 10 or 12 of these that really create a community within the company for those people. And I attend their meetings myself every month or so for one of them, and really get the culture that is created among those folks to have a reason other than Lockheed Martin employee badge to connect. And so between our sort of recruiting and support of STEM education, especially in minority states serving institutions, our successful recruiting of getting those folks in, and then having those BRGs there to give them that additional community sense, I think it's working really well for us.
You've talked about recruiting talent. Talk to me about retention. We've heard of the Great Resignations, Forbes cover on this, a lot of talk. How do you think about keeping people here? What works and really, what challenges have you had? I think this is on every CEO's mind right now.
Right, and the retention has gotten more difficult, but it's actually in fairly good shape compared to the overall economy. We've seen data of upwards of 20% turnover a year in the broad economy. What we've been experiencing in our industry is more like 5 to 10, and we're on the lower end of that. So that's still twice as much as usual. So our usual turnover rate, voluntary turnover rate's been about 3%, 2.5 to 3. Now it's like 5 to 6. And that does need addressing. It needs more, more attention. And in our world, there are these classified spaces, right? So if you have a classified program that you're on, or you're working with a customer who's in a classified environment, you have to have a security clearance, first of all, and you are in a room with no windows typically for your entire workday. And you really can't talk to many people about what you're doing. And so there's a sense of isolation that can occur. So our space division, which has a lot of classified work, knew that was a retention issue, because if I can go work for, Microsoft down the street and not have to deal with all of this, I might think about that.
Right.
So they created a program called Skiff Life, so that people that have to work in these enclosed classified spaces have outlets that, like, literally plants inside, TVs that look like windows. I mean, they're little things, but it just showed that the people that, we get that this is not ideal in some ways, and we're doing what we can. We can't reduce the classification of your program, but we can do some things to help you and make sure that, you get outdoors and other things during the day that before you didn't have an access to.
Yeah. So one of the things that we started talking about is, in addition to political polarization, a real feeling of uncertainty, which I think is, Foreign Affairs, it's 100th anniversary publication this month, The Age of Uncertainty is the cover, right? This is widely shared. And I think a lot of people really feel this. Climate change is a huge component of this, certainly. We now have in California and in the American West, fire seasons, which are no longer really seasons. They're part of everyday life. Right. What is Lockheed doing to think about climate change? How are you, both from an installation perspective, thinking about your own energy use and sustainability goals, and how are you thinking about the geostrategic challenges that climate change brings?
Sure. So on the internally viewed side of this, we have a sustainability plan that I think is very thorough. There are certain things that we can't help. Our airplanes do burn fuel. They have afterburners on them. There's going to be a lot of fuel use by our customers of our product. We can't necessarily control that, but the things we can control are what's the proportion of electricity we get off of renewable sources. I think we have one of the largest solar farms in Southern California at our Palmdale Skunk Works operation. That's one example of investments we're making to try to make sure that we reduce our own carbon footprint. Secondly, the geopolitical risks around climate change are going to mount over the years. The Defense Department's already recognized that.
Sure.
And so there might be threats down the road that we need to understand that will come from that. But something I've found, at least somewhat obvious, I thought, when I joined the company, was we've got all the tools to address one of the biggest climate issues that we can get our hands on, which is the wildfire issue, right? So wildfires have two detrimental effects to climate. One is they take out trees that would otherwise absorb carbon dioxide. And secondly, that the smoke from the fires is pollution in and of itself, and pretty bad particulate pollution at that. So I thought about all the things that we do for 21st century security concept, which is how do we network platforms and products and systems we have together to accomplish a mission. Well, the mission here is how do we predict, detect, and suppress wildfires much better than we ever could before with what we have today. We're not going to invent a new type of fire truck or some kind of plane that will be able to put the fires out anytime soon, but what do we have today, and how can we network them together to make this a much more addressable national problem? So what do we have? We've got satellites that detect infrared activity. So it could be a missile launch, but it also could be someone that left their campfire going and it's starting to catch. We also do weather satellites for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the Commerce Department that do weather prediction and monitoring. Well, that gives you wind information, the humidity, all these other force factors. We also make helicopters called Firehawks that are in service today, putting out fires. We make the C-130, which can be configured to also be an aircraft that puts out fires. And we have a command and control system that does a lot of data fusion and figures out for commanders for the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, what they should do next or what their options are. So I was like, why don't we just put all this together, because the mission is firefighting and the enemy's the fire. Let's do that. And what was amazing about this company is that everybody around that table, it's one of our executive meetings, they said, why don't we just do this? And now we're doing it. So what we've got so far is I asked for, let's be able to put on an iPad, an app that we can give to fire commanders today that will give them prediction of where the fire perimeter is and where it's going to go in with real-time data, real information from space. And we're going to show that to some of our customers in government this month, actually, later this month, where we're going to be able to bring in an app. We're going to get a big screen so they can really see it. And we're working with NVIDIA on this, for example. NVIDIA is you think it's a kind of a gaming chip and, simulation company. Well, they have a super great AI engine, and they know how to model natural phenomenon in a way that you can predict what's going to happen if there's a lightning strike somewhere, for example. And so we're working with them to create this app that, instead of waiting, it takes about 24 hours now to get what the fire perimeter is today to a fire commander. We think we can get that done in an hour or two.
Wow. Change
the whole game just on that one part. And when we start adding in the assets and we start networking them together and figuring out where should these helicopters be deployed. Right now, LA County has some, state of California has some, Colorado Fire has some. They're owned and operated by widely distributed entities. But if we could actually fuse all the data that they're all looking at and saying, look, the conditions for a fire starting in Colorado are low this week, but in Southern California, they're high. We might deploy assets over there. And there might be better trading among the states and counties of these assets, which they don't want to give up, because what if fire starts now in my area?
Right.
And then the third iteration of all of this is the concept I'm talking a little bit to the Commerce Department about now, is why don't we think about a national firefighting SWAT team, right? And put some of those assets into play where they can be fungible anywhere where the highest fire risk is.
Well, so the White House convened, I believe it was Liz Sherwood, right, is bringing folks together on some of this. And you've been a part of these conversations. This is, I think, really fascinating. Truman Center just put out a big report on subnational diplomacy, right? You've got folks who are making national security policy decision makers really at the state level. Tell me a little bit about some of the decision making that you think needs to come together on this. Are you working this state by state? You're talking to governor's offices or LA County. Are we getting to a place where there needs to be some kind of consortia of decision makers so that that information can be moved faster?
There's an all of the above here, unfortunately. Right now, even at the federal government level, there are 3 secretary departments involved, right? Cabinet level departments. So this Commerce Secretary owns the NOAA satellites, for example. The Agriculture Department runs the fire service. There is a fire service that's out deployed for the Agriculture Department. Then you have the Interior Department for federal lands, who does firefighting management for the federal lands. So you've got 3 departments we got to get together in the first place. Then you've got the states. Then you've got the counties and municipalities. So I think to try to disrupt that entire system, it's like, let's not change the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Let's not change that, leave that. But how do we use all those assets in a more intelligent way? So one of our other partners is Salesforce. And well, what does Salesforce have to do with firefighting? Well, they have a communication and AI-driven kind of networking system that we could figure out where the risk is with NVIDIA and our system, tie in Salesforce potentially. We haven't figured this all out yet. To see where all the assets are and who's got an ability to transfer assets in this sort of market system, if you will. And then again, my third level concept here is there should be a national SWAT team, so we don't have to go through all this. But that's how you can apply a company's skills like ours to a national problem. It doesn't have to do.
No, it's really interesting.
So we're going to do more of that. I'll give you one more, which I think is also out of this world, which is Lunar Services, right? So we're going to send astronauts to the moon, and it'll happen again and again. It may not just be the United States, it may be other countries doing it. Well, they're all going to need services on the moon ultimately, right? they're going to need transportation, moon buggy, right? They're going to need navigation services, like where am I? The third thing is going to need is communication that's reliable. And so we've set up a fully owned subsidiary in our company called Lockheed Martin Evolve. And this concept is going to be driven by that unit, which is going to be operated differently than the rest of Lockheed Martin, to say, okay, this is an out there concept. There's no customer right now. There's no contract coming in from DoD or anyone else. But how would we organize ourselves to deliver that and as a service? And when that moon buggy's up there, it'll be autonomous. It'll be connected with the communication system, and it can do scientific missions when there's no astronaut on the moon to drive it.
Yeah.
So when you take these 21st century technologies like AI, distributed computing, autonomy, you can take assets that would be wasted or unused and get a lot more out of them. So this concept is another one where, like the firefighting, what's a national objective or problem, and how can we apply all those 21st century and those physical technologies into that?
I mean, what I hear you saying, Jim, in all of this, that I think is a really key insight, is that after you get to a certain point, it doesn't, the technology always matters, but that's not the differentiator. It's really about how we're using it,
right,
and about how we're layering it in and how quickly we can deploy it. So these challenges on acquisition strategy, moving out of silos, all of this is getting to whether it's the war maker the war fighter faster, or it's somebody dumping water in a wildfire in California.
right.
It's bringing all of this to bear at the same time for a range of assets or threats rather.
Right.
As we kind of start to close on our time here today, I'm interested in how you think about some of these leadership lessons. I mean, on the one hand, you come from an Air Force background. You have firsthand experience flying the planes that the company now produces, or then, and you're here in this role years later. But in other respects, you've come from a background that is somewhat less traditional through your time in telecom. What do you think has been one of the unifying threads of your career? And as you have approached choices about opportunities, what do you think has kind of propelled you? What motivates you? What has led you to make some of these different decisions along the way?
Seeing an opportunity to do something dramatically different and hopefully better, right? So my last company, we were pretty small starting out, and I joined on September 10th, 2001, and September 11th was the next day. So it got really busy really fast there, and we had a really tough time. And I was telling some of the team earlier here, our stock was under $1. We got a delisting letter from the New York Stock Exchange. So we had to do some dramatic change to save the company, and we did. And then it became pretty successful in the United States. And I'm like, well, this is a global technology, 3G to 4G, for example, in telecom. We should be a global company. We should be the global leader, not just the US leader. And so we had to drive a really significant change program in our own company, which we had just saved, as a team, 4 or 5 years before that. And then we had to do it again when 5G came. And so now American Tower owns data center systems and other things that we didn't have before. So there were almost 3 iterations of dramatic change because there's a huge opportunity there in that particular company. And, the market cap went from, to be generous, like $2 or $3 billion in, the early 2000s to now it's like, 130 billion. So it's all worked out well because we saw the inflection points and the opportunities and actually drove a significant change program through our own organization first and then elsewhere to really go to the next level, so to speak. And I think that's incredibly important here in this industry right now. And that's why I actually did a late career change and accepted my colleagues' unexpected invitation to become CEO at this company, because I think the situation is really significant and important. If we can't maintain an effective deterrent against China, they will act. They run under a philosophy of Sun Tzu, in that they like to quietly build their force until they think they have 90% or so probability of success, and then they will act aggressively. What I want to do with, and make hopefully Lockheed Martin the pathfinder of this, is to get the defense enterprise to keep moving that 90% goalpost farther into the future with 21st century digital technology, so that the Chinese decision makers never get to a point to say, I'm at my target now, I'm going to act decisively, which is what unfortunately Vladimir Putin decided to do in Ukraine for other reasons. But we want to be the vanguard and pathfinder of how do you just keep moving that deterrence goalpost farther and farther out into time, and hopefully it's infinite, and there is never again a great power war, because the conditions are evolving where there could be, and if there's a way to defer that indefinitely, that's what this company can do as a pathfinder. And we want to work with government, we want to work with our industry colleagues on open architecture to do this.
Yeah.
So
how do you bring your competitors along as partners? How do you think about that dynamic in a moment when we need all of that talent at the table?
I think it's a Kansas situation. You got show me state. And so we've taken that approach with our customer base and also with some of our colleagues. The commercial businesses, like I've talked about, Verizon, NVIDIA, Intel, Qualcomm, et cetera, Microsoft, they take chances like this all the time, so they're fine with it.
Right.
And to them, it's not their whole business. So for our industry to kind of come in and say, okay, we're going to turn our company on its side. We're used to doing products and platforms and selling them to the Army, Air Force, or Navy. We're going to turn our entire company on its side, like Lockheed says they're doing. And we're going to do mission capability as our end product, not an airplane or a ship or a tank.
It's a big shift.
It's a huge, it's a orthogonal, perpendicular shift of how you run your whole organization. The benefit for our shareholders here is that if we're successful in driving this, and our platforms are on what we call the 5G.mil architecture before anyone else is, well, they'll be more attractive platforms.
Yeah.
So the helicopters we build and the aircraft and Aegis, shipborne systems, they'll be even more attractive to either buy, the customer buys more of them or keeps the ones they have longer, because they are part of this 5G.mil architecture.
Yeah. So as we close here, we've covered a lot of waterfront here in our time, and thank you for that. What do you have to say to our Truman members who are earlier in their careers, approaching, in some cases, their first leadership positions? What are some of those kind of core tenets as you think about yourself as a senior leader that have served you really well?
I think it's the basics, treat people with respect, first of all. You're never going to build a following or lead if you can't engender respect among the people you're trying to lead. The second thing is, have some kind of a vision. Where do you want to go with this institution or this university or this government organization? And make sure it's worth your while, like worth everyone's while to say, okay, I'm going to put extra effort in. I told the executive team here, I said, I know you guys and gals all have really hard jobs, but your jobs are going to get a lot harder, okay? And the only way you're going to be able to do them is, first of all, step up. I didn't ask them this. You could tell, who's ready to do 5+ years of more effort than they're used to. And then secondly, you got to have a first-class team with you, or you're not going to succeed. So I ask, if there's one piece of advice I have for someone that really wants to go to the next level in their career is, do you have the best team you've ever had in your career? If not, why not? And what are you going to do about it?
I like that challenge. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
What a pleasure.
Yeah.